Is my bow tie straight?
Yes.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rich Maneri. I'm Deputy Opinion Editor here at LNP. And for the next few minutes, for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about maybe the most divisive issue facing the country right now, and that is gun violence and gun legislation. With me today are Lancaster Mayor Rick Gray and LNP Outdoors writer P.J. Reilly. Both Mayor Gray and P.J. have written on this subject, and there are editorials currently posted on our website, written by both gentlemen, that ran in our Sunday Perspective section. I think it's fair to say both have opposing viewpoints, and we're going to examine those viewpoints and kind of where we are in this debate right now. Mayor Gray, I want to start with you. You have said that there is room in this debate for compromise with legislation. Can you give us an idea in your mind where we are in this debate and where we're going?
Well, I think the problem is the people who are the most adamant and most vocal about the rights of those who possess firearms and own firearms are unwilling to make even the most minor change in the law. For example, people say, well, we don't need new laws, enforce the laws that you have. We pass an ordinance that says that within 3 days after finding a gun was stolen, you have to report it to the police department. Now, the reason for that is twofold. One, to let the police know that an illegal firearm is in circulation, but two, to take away the excuse that straw purchasers, people who would buy guns legally and sell them illegally, use when the gun is then later used in a criminal act. That's not really a new law. What that is enforcing the current law we have and trying to bring about some effort to enforce and to limit straw purchases. We were sued because of that. We still are being sued. The city of Lancaster is, because we said within 3 days you have to report the lost or stolen firearm. So, again, we'd like to talk to gun rights advocates and discuss, what middle ground is there. Certainly, we recognize the fact that the Second Amendment is there. The Supreme Court has said you have a constitutional right to own and possess a firearm. Fine. They've also said there's limitations on that. What are the limitations, and how can we best really develop a policy that really interferes the least amount as possible with those who would own guns for lawful purposes and lawfully, and those who would use them for criminal enterprise? How do we find the middle ground on it? Well, we can't if the other side won't talk to us about anything. Again, the lost and stolen firearm provision in our ordinance. Our chief of police said, you don't need a law that you have to report stolen lawn ornaments. People report really gun owners, legal gun owners, the minute that they would discover that their firearm has been stolen. I would guess almost 100% of them would immediately report that to the police. So again, it's to ferret out wrongdoers, and it's not a new law, really. What it is an attempt to enforce the laws we have. So we just got to start talking about things.
In terms of legislation, what is compromise? What does compromise look like?
I think reporting lost and stolen guns is a compromise. It doesn't infringe on the lawful possession of a firearm. It doesn't infringe on in any way on the use of a firearm, other than the illegal use of transport or sale of a firearm. So that would be a simple example of what we could do. There were suggestions limiting sales of guns to 1 gun a month. So my wife and I can only buy 24 guns a year. There were objections to that. I can understand some of the objections to it. But again, there has to be a dialogue before we can do anything. You can't compromise with yourself.
One of the things you touched on, PJ touched on in the articles on Sunday was that there's a lot of discussion about types of weapons. In your view, how do we compromise, or is there room for compromise on types of weapons? I'm going to get to PJ in that.
Well, again, I'm not going to compromise with myself. There has to be a discussion and a dialogue. We've already compromised. You can't own an anti-tank gun. You know, you can't own an automatic weapon unless you have special license and go through all various steps that you have to do that. So, you know, is there room for compromise? Well, that's the NRA whether there's room for compromise. I don't hear anything in the way of attempts to compromise from them. And I can't compromise with myself. Does the gun have a legitimate lawful purpose? And if it does, are there ways to regulate it so as to protect the public from the illegal and unlawful use of it? Firearm clips. Why do you need more than 10 bullets in a clip? I think that's a reasonable compromise. Nobody's taking anybody's gun away from them. On the other hand, you can't get a clip with 30 or 100 bullets in it. So, you know, you ask me to compromise. I'd say compromise with what? You know, there's no dialogue.
But by the way, I should tell you, we invite your questions and comments, and we will certainly respond to that as best we can. We have one coming in right now, Andrea.
This is from Anthony Cazillo on Facebook. This is for Mayor Gray. He said earlier you mentioned that the Constitution grants us the right to bear arms. Do you believe the right to bear arms is a positive right or a negative right?
Excuse me, didn't hear that. The question was for Mayor Gray. Do you believe the right to bear arms is a positive right or a negative right?
Well, I don't know what positive or negative means in that context. Does it mean that the government can't interfere in any way with it? Well, if you read the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia. Okay, now, I don't want to argue about what it was, because initially the Second Amendment was a states' right amendment to allow the states to have militias. But it does provide for well-regulated. I would say it's a right that you have that, like every other right, is a regulated right. So it's a positive to the extent that you have a right to bear arms, but it's also limited by well-regulation, by regulating that right. The same I used in my article on Sunday. The right to free speech. You can't slander somebody. That is against the law. You can't falsely yell fire in a crowded theater. That's free speech, but it's limited free speech. Similarly, the right to possess a firearm is limited by regulations necessary to protect the public. So it's both. It's a limitation on government, and to that extent, it keeps the government out of your business. On the other hand, it's positive to the extent that the government has the right to regulate.
In terms of PJ Reilly, LMP Outdoors writer. PJ, in your piece that ran on Sunday, you seem to say that you believe the focus of this debate is misguided. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, it just seems like when a shooting like occurred in Orlando happened, there is an automatic jump to by people who want to ban certain types of guns. And they hold up guns like the AR-15 and they say, normal civilians shouldn't, there's no reason someone should have a gun like this. People who know guns, I don't consider myself a gun expert. I own guns, I use guns, I know some things about guns. That's how I would describe myself. But we hear and see things that they're talking about with guns like the AR-15. What is it? It's a semi-automatic rifle with a detachable magazine. Well, it looks nasty, but that's what it is. So when you start talking about you shouldn't have guns like that, what do you mean? What are you going to take away? In my article, I referenced a gun called the Remington 750 Woodmaster. That's not one that you see people holding up saying, civilians don't need guns like this, but yet it's a semi-automatic rifle with a detachable magazine. So my concern is when you start splitting hairs about what should you have, what shouldn't you have, that's where I get concerned, because you can cover a whole lot of guns with a broad stroke when you start talking about that. Most handguns today are semi-automatic with detachable magazines. Where is this line? I've never heard where this line wants to be. They just hold up an AR-15 and say, you shouldn't have a gun like this. Well, as I wrote, I don't have an AR-15. I have a gun that's similar to it. It's a Remington. It's called a 30 Remington AR. It's a semi-automatic rifle with a detachable magazine. I use mine for hunting and target shooting. That's why I bought it. That's why I have it. Some people buy guns for self-defense. That's not why I have mine. That's a personal choice. But those are legal uses for a gun like that, hunting and target shooting. I use it for those purposes. My concern is someone taking that away, saying you don't need it. Well, that's your judgment, not mine.
So you would see an effort to ban a particular weapon as a slippery slope toward
Definitely. That is
More
definitely a slippery slope, because I can just see where that would go. That could really get into the weeds. Me personally, what Mayor Gray just mentioned about limiting people to owning no more magazines that hold no more than 10 rounds. For me personally, I'm okay with that. My magazines hold 4. That's all they have. But if someone were to say, oh, you shouldn't have one more than that, I'm okay with that. That's me personally. I'm not the NRA. They may have a different viewpoint on that, but I personally don't have an issue with that. And there was regulation back under the federal firearms, federal assault ban years ago. There were some magazines that were outlawed. I'm remembering the drum magazine in particular, which held like 75 or 100 rounds. That went away. People can now own those magazines. But even that was difficult, because it was, if you already owned these magazines, you could have these magazines. So there were already tens of thousands, if not millions, of these magazines out there. And it just seemed to be a very difficult situation. But that's one area where I personally would not have a magazine limitation.
Where do you stand on what have been called so-called common sense measures, background checks, broader background checks?
That term makes me nervous as well. What's common sense gun legislation? What's common sense for one person may not be common sense for me. I worry about things like that are subjective and open-ended. That's not saying, for me, again, that's not saying I wouldn't be willing to talk about things, like the mayor mentioned, with having to report a stolen gun. I can tell you if one of mine went missing, I'd be calling the police right away, no question. So I think there's room for discussion there. Again, that's me, but whenever we hear things like common sense gun legislation, or we shouldn't have these guns, I never hear specifics. And my concern is that there would just be a broad, sweeping regulation that would take in a whole lot more than probably even the people who proposed it originally intended. They probably weren't intending to do that, but in order to meet the legal guidelines, they have to pull in a lot of things that they didn't mean. That's something to really
If I could respond to that. You know, the problem with that is it's exactly what I referred to earlier. There already are limitations on firearms. I can't go out and buy a fully automatic machine gun. They're there. And similarly, I'm not nearly as well versed in firearms as PJ is. Can we discuss what guns, the unlawful use of those firearms is such that it poses a danger to society generally? And maybe an AR-15 isn't it? I don't know. But to say that any regulation at all, or any new gun, means that somewhere down the road, your right to bear arms is going to be infringed upon, to me it means we can't talk about it, really. And we've already done that. We've already done it with weapons that are military weapons, machine guns, anti-tank devices, mortars. We can't possess them. So if you don't have the dialogue, if people like PJ don't educate me as to what firearms are for, how they're used, what they are, plus we don't take into account the general public's interest, nothing happens. And to just set up this wall, you can't do anything, because if you do, it's the nose of the candle under the tent. To me, this means exactly what I said initially, and that is you can't compromise, you can't work the thing out.
PJ, one of the arguments has been, well, why do you need a weapon like an AR or like the one that was used in the regular shooting to target?
It's an accurate gun. It's a popular gun. It's one that's out there. American history is filled with military weapons transitioning into the private sector. You can take the Henry rifle. That's a lever action rifle that was introduced during the Civil War, used widely during the Civil War. Now you can go out anywhere and see cowboy action shoots. They're shooting Henry rifles. These are guns that are introduced through the military and then come down through the private sector. Even the musket was once a weapon of war, but I don't think anybody's arguing that today. So these are guns. There are, we have hundreds of thousands of military people who have used these guns. They come out of the military. These are guns they're familiar with. They know how they work. They know how they shoot. They want to use them at home. Why not? What's going on?
Again, perhaps you could educate me, but it's my understanding that some of these, an AR-15, for example, has a relatively small bullet. It's a little bit bigger than 22, I think.
That's correct.
Which is 22 I'm familiar with. But I've also been told that they tumble in some way, that the entrance wound is small, but the damage it does in the exit wound is large, that they're meant to inflict serious bodily injury on another person that they're shot with. Is that accurate?
Well, I would argue a 223 hitting you would be much better than a 50 caliber, which there's a gun out there called a 50 caliber BMG. I see guys shooting them at the ranges here in Lancaster County for long range. I think there are people who would say they'd rather be hit by 223 than a 50 caliber. It is designed, it's light, again, for the military, even for hunters. You don't want to be carrying around magazines loaded with big, heavy ammunition. That just adds to it.
But does anybody use that kind of gun for hunting?
Yes.
They do?
I got shot here with a 223. It's very popular for varmints, coyotes, groundhogs, things like that, but there are places where you can hunt them. You can use them for deer. I shot deer in South Carolina with a 223.
Let me just interrupt for a second. We have some questions coming in for our readers. This is from Sal. He says, it's more of a statement than a question, but I'll turn it into a question. Criminals don't care about laws. That is, by definition, why they are criminals. Can you respond to this, Mayor Gray? Criminals are going to be able to get their hands on guns, no matter how you legislate.
Well, under the current laws, there's no question about that. I just got some statistics. 20 guns were reported stolen in the city of Lancaster so far this year. 3 stolen guns have been recovered. There's been 32 gun arrests. That kind of argument, well, they're going to get guns anyway. I wonder if the person who poses that question feels the same about drugs. They're going to legalize all drugs. They're going to get them anyway. Does that mean we shouldn't do anything? When things like these mass shootings occur, first thing you hear is, well, these proposed gun regulations wouldn't have made any difference in this shooting. Are we proposing laws that would limit any future harm being done to people? No. But on the other hand, how do I prove a negative? How about reporting a lost and stolen gun? How about if somebody's reporting a stolen gun that's recovered and was not used to shoot a person? How about a person that tried to get an AR-15 and couldn't get it because they're on the list of people who are prohibited from owning or buying firearms? so they couldn't get it and they couldn't shoot people. How about that? Additionally, most of the firearm deaths in this country, well, an awful lot of them are suicides, probably more than half of them are suicides. But the other thing is, most of them are one-on-one or one-on-two. They're not mass shootings. Daily, I think it's, I can't remember the statistics, but it's 30, 40, 60 people are shot in the United States and killed on a daily basis. 30,000 people a year die from firearms in the United States. Does that mean we shouldn't try to do anything at all about it? How many people got the Zika virus so far in the United States? Oh my God, they're appropriating $1 billion and we've got to stop the mosquitoes. Why can't we pay a little attention to the things that are actually doing harm to us right now and see if there's reasonable ways to work to try to keep these one-on-one incidences, these other incidences to a minimum? The other thing is with firearms, with suicides, well, people can say, well, you're going to commit suicide anyway. How many suicides do people take, or attempted suicides? Do they take, let's say, sleeping pills, and then change their mind and call a friend and have their stomach climb? With a firearm, if you put a firearm up to your temple and pull the trigger, there's no second thought about it. So why not do background checks? Why not check people out? Terrorist watch list. People can't fly on an airplane with me, but they can buy an AR-15. You want common sense? That's common sense. Now, you see people on the other side gushing about these individuals' rights to due process. Well, I wish they would feel that strongly about due process in so many other areas. But here, all of a sudden, someone's on a terrorist watch list, and all you can be concerned about is their due process right to possess a firearm, or the due process in prohibiting them from possessing a firearm. What about the constitutional right to travel? They have a right to travel. You've limited that. So, that's common sense. You want common sense? Terrorist watch list, you shouldn't be able to buy a firearm. There should be a way to have a hearing and get off that watch list if you're on it inappropriately. Yet on the other hand, to say we're going to keep you off an airplane, but we're going to let you have a gun is crazy in my opinion.
Let me get to PJ in a second. By the way, my apologies. That question actually came in from David Millside from Lancaster. And we're going to get to more
Hi,
questions
Dave.
in a minute. My apologies for that. We're going to get to PJ.
I know Dave, but hi.
You, in your article on Sunday, had expressed frustration over these mass shootings. So I guess the question is, if not to the gun itself, where do we go as a society in terms of trying to stop this?
For me in particular, again, I'm speaking for myself, I'm not as educated on the background checks as Mayor Gray is, but what he mentioned about background checks, I personally don't have a problem with that. Background checks should limit, if there's somebody on a terror watch list, should that person have a gun? My personal opinion is no. That's me. But where does it go? Again, I'm not, Mayor Gray mentioned about being able to have a discussion. I'm open to a discussion. What I can tell you in the past couple days is I've tried to have discussions with people and it just goes nowhere quickly. It hits a brick wall. It comes back to the same things I hear time and again. You don't need that gun. That's someone's judgment. So, like I said, I'm open to the conversation. It hasn't gone well for me the last couple of days.
One of our, we have a question coming in. Andrea?
This is from Brent on Facebook. And just in general, do you think the gun lobby is affecting the lack of discussion about firearms?
If you didn't hear that, Brent from Facebook, do you think the gun lobby is affecting the discussion on firearms? And you both can answer this.
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't think the NRA represents a lot of legitimate gun owners. And I say legitimate because to a certain degree, some of the things they propose or some of the things they oppose really makes it easier for the worst elements to get firearms and use firearms. PJ and I go back, I don't know how many years, a lot of years. You can sit down and talk about it. You know, I relate to guns, or people relate to guns. A lot of my friends do, the way I relate to motorcycles. I was chairman of the board of the American Motorcyclists Association. I own 11 motorcycles right now. I love them. I love to ride motorcycles. I have friends that are the same way about firearms. They love to shoot, they love to target shoot, they love to hunt. Somebody's delivering some venison at my house this morning. You know, I don't hunt, but I sure heck eat venison. So, you know, I don't have a problem with that, and I understand where they're coming from. On the other hand, me possessing a motorcycle doesn't mean I can ride with straight pipes and blast a whole neighborhood, and wake them up at 1 o'clock in the morning. There are limitations on the use of that. Similarly, when I gave a motorcycle to my son, I had to go and transfer the title. I had to show there were no liens on the title. He had to show that he had insurance that would cover the motorcycle. We had to go to AAA and get the title transferred. Is a background check that big a deal within a family? Is a background check for any transfer of firearms that big a deal? We do it with something as innocuous as a motorcycle, which you don't have any constitutional right to possess. But why couldn't we do it with firearms? Is it that big a deal to attempt to keep them out of the hands of people who would use them on law?
I'm going to pose the same question to PJ. Make it clear, PJ, you're not here representing the NRA.
Right.
But is the gun lobby, as a gun owner, as a sportsman, you write an outboard column here, is the NRA and the gun lobby, or at least factions of the gun lobby, in the way?
Well, let me say, from my perspective, what I see, and coincidentally, I'm not currently a member of the NRA. I have been. That's not for any political reasons. I'm just not a member right now. I have been in the past. But what I see happening is the NRA frames their positions on things. And just like I've felt the last couple of days, they kind of have to put up this wall because the attacks are so vehement, and because the suggestions, common sense gun legislation, shouldn't have these guns, are so innocuous. They have, from my perspective, they have to go in with concern and sort of their defenses up, because you don't know where this is going. And so their position seems to be they're going to stand up for the Second Amendment, people's right to have guns. I know one of the things, one of the issues people talk about are smart guns. Guns that only the owner could fire as a way to keep other people from using it. The NRA actually has no problem with that. The gun industry has no problem. What they have a problem with is, to date, including the government has spent millions of dollars on smart gun technology, nothing has been reliable. The NRA's position is, we don't want you to say you can only have smart guns because they're unreliable. So it's that kind of tightrope walking that they end up having to do.
We have another question from one of our readers, Sal. It brings up Chicago. Chicago has some of the most, if not the most, restrictive gun laws in the country, and a terrible gun violence problem. Proof that no matter what you legislate, it's not going to work. No.
Well, again, we have a serious heroin problem in Lancaster County with overdoses. So let's legalize heroin, because there's nothing we can do about it. Chicago is not an island. New York City is not an island. When Bloomberg was mayor of New York City, they did a study and found a very high percentage of the firearms that were used illegally in New York City came from Pennsylvania. We're not an island. Our lost and stolen gun ordinance in Lancaster is very difficult to enforce because of, I don't want to get into legally, the jurisdictional questions and whatnot. Why did we pass it? Because the state wouldn't pass it. If we had a reasonable national gun policy, some of it wouldn't happen. Now, they say, look at the violence in Chicago. There's plenty of causes for the violence in Chicago other than people having guns. And to address all of those is another thing. But to say there's nothing we can do, well, if you make that little island of Chicago, it's awfully close to Wisconsin, it's awfully close to Indiana, it's on the interstate. It's easy to get in. So you can have very strict gun laws in one jurisdiction, and you can go a mile down the road and buy a gun without any problem at all. And recently was a person, I think it was in the Inquirer, that decided that they wanted to see how difficult it was to buy an AR-15. And it took them 7 minutes, go into a gun shop, get a background check, and walk out. And she had no idea how to use an AR-15. I could go get a license right now to carry a concealed carry license and go buy a semi-automatic pistol and not know how to load it. What are we doing? You know, you need a driver's license to drive a car. Some states have regulation as to who can possess a firearm, the training you need, at least the ability to show that you know how to load it, how to unload it, how to clean it, how to maintain it. So, yeah, Chicago has a problem. To say that gun laws don't work, to blame it on gun laws, I disagree. I think Chicago has a lot of problems right now, and gun laws are just guns are just a manifestation of that. But you can't circle the District of Columbia and have states around it that you can easily get firearms, and then say, well, the District of Columbia, the gun laws don't work because there are shootings in the District of Columbia. It's just not that simple.
That's one area, if I could jump in and say, that's one area where I think Mayor Gray and I may disagree a little bit. The reporter went and bought an AR-15 and didn't know how to use it. That's where the responsibility part comes in. She or he, I don't know which it was legally allowed to own a gun, and so she went and she bought a gun in 7 minutes. There's some, I've seen that report, that there's some disbelief that you can do this in 7 minutes. If you're legally allowed to own one, then you can go in and buy one. That's not a problem. And then it's your responsibility to know what to do with it. I use beer in my column. If I'm 21 years old, I can go and buy beer. I can buy as much beer as I want. It's up to me to use it responsibly. Same with the gun. It's up to the owner to use it responsibly. The government puts that responsibility on you. It's a freedom to own the gun. It's your responsibility to use it.
I have quite a follow-up question to that. You can't legislate responsibility when it comes to alcohol consumption. Can you legislate responsibility when you're relying on the individual to be a responsible gun?
You're relying on them to use alcohol responsibly, and I quoted the statistic, 100,000 alcohol-related deaths versus 33,000 guns. I don't want to compare deaths, they're all horrible, but there's a number. There's a higher number of people who don't use alcohol responsibly.
And what do we do in response to it? We increase the penalties, we make it easier to prosecute someone for driving under the influence of alcohol. We incarcerate people with multiple violations. How do you stop?
Like mandatory minimums for firearms.
Well, yeah, but how do you stop somebody? You know, to say to enforce the laws that we have already. Okay, let's enforce the laws that we have already against the shooter in Orlando. There's 49 dead people. He's dead. What are you going to do? Shouldn't you try to take some action to prevent that type of person from getting a firearm? Are you going to be 100% successful? No. How about if you're 5% successful and you save 50 lives? Is it worth it? Yeah, I think it is worth it. And so often the gun lobby tries to get us to say, well, no, this wouldn't have worked in Orlando, it wouldn't have worked in Orlando. Where it does work, you don't see it. Because the guns are kept out of the hands of irresponsible. I agree with you, and you're going to have an implement that can seriously injure another person, or a weapon, really. Why isn't some level of competency required? You know, what do you need a driver's license for? The heck, you know, you get a car, you go drive a car. I know some people are going to say, well, that's a privilege, not a right. But with alcohol, That's not a right. And so if a guy goes out and gets drunk and drives the car, we don't wait for him to run over somebody. If he's stopped and found to be drunk, he's penalized at that point just for operating. But if you want to analogize it that way, why don't we do the same thing with guns? Why don't we require a level of competency?
We've got about 10 minutes left, and we certainly encourage the participation. We have more questions coming in. Andrea?
Yeah, this is from John on Facebook. He would like to know why in Pennsylvania the convicted felons can get hunting licenses and still buy rifles and ammunition and hunt.
John on Facebook, I'm not sure if you heard that. Why can convicted felons get hunting rifles? I don't think you can.
Comes as a surprise to me. I don't believe he can. And I know our district attorney, from talking with him, is adamant, and I agree with him 100%, that firearms, or felons not to possess firearms should be strictly enforced. If you're a felon, you should be getting a firearm. And in fact, the Supreme Court, I didn't read the whole decision, but I read the reports of it, recently said even for a misdemeanor of domestic violence, you shouldn't be allowed to possess a firearm. I'm not too sure myself that that doesn't go a little too far, because I've seen relatively minor incidents. Yet it shows that there are limitations that can be placed on this right. If I could, one other thing here. You know, we recently, we sued the governor, the city, and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh sued the governor and the General Assembly for the manner in which a law was passed which would allow anybody who could lawfully possess a firearm in Pennsylvania to sue the city of Lancaster or any other municipality for passing any law relating to firearms. The Commonwealth Court and the Supreme Court said the manner in which they passed that was unconstitutional. The NRA right now got a bill reported out of the Senate committee and is on the Senate floor now. Senate Bill 1330, which would reauthorize anybody, somebody from Aliquippa who's never been in Lancaster, could sue Lancaster because we have a lost and stolen firearm. If we were found not to have that right, would have to pay for their lawyer. If we were found to have that right, they don't have to pay for our lawyer. So they can harass us. Anybody that wants to in the state, including the NRA or the ACLU or the Ku Klux Klan, would be able to sue us under this law. You talked about the gun lobby before. In Harrisburg, they're so afraid of doing anything that could in any way cause some political opponent to arise against them, that it's not worth taking on the NRA, no matter whose interests are at stake now in the Senate in Pennsylvania. And again, it's going to harden the lines. If they pass it, it's going to make people like me a lot more adamant about what we do and the fact that there's no room in government for these issues.
BJ, where do you see this debate going at this point? I mean, we tend to have this debate, at least more loudly, after there's a mass shooting. And then it subsides, and then it ratchets up again. Where do you see this going?
Well, and if I could take a shot at my own industry.
Sure.
The media kind of helps feed into the hysteria over these situations because of a general lack of knowledge. I read an excellent column this week, I think it was in Slate, by a woman who said, why don't media outlets have gun experts as the reporters? They use the analogy we would send a sports reporter to cover a criminal court case. So they end up putting people in these positions to report on these events, and they inherently get things wrong. Indeed, unfortunately, had an egregious error in an article about really their shooting 2 weeks ago. But that's out there. That gets out there. People see that. That helps feed into it. There's people talk about the assault rifle, quote unquote assault rifle. That is a media creation. There are some people in the industry who tell you there is no such thing as an assault rifle. When it is talked about in the industry, it's only fully automatic. An assault rifle generally is any rifle that's used for an assault in an action. But the media, if they say assault rifle, immediately an image comes into your head of what they're talking about. I had this discussion with an editor here once before. The industry term is modern sporting rifle for an AR-15 style gun. I was told to use assault rifle because that's what people know. That's wrong. That's a problem. That perpetuates this problem that people have with these guns. Again, Mayor Gray makes a lot of good points about the lobby effort and laws regarding common sense that people should use in terms of who should have guns, who shouldn't have guns. I'm not qualified to talk about that. What I am is a guy who owns guns, who uses guns for legitimate purposes, and I see people trying to take that away. I don't know that they mean to, but that's what they're doing because of some of the things, the rhetoric that they.
Let me just ask you a follow-up question. Is it possible to ban a certain weapon or a certain category of weapons and have it not chisel away at the second?
Well, let me say, like full auto is illegal, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops to get it. It can happen. But once you come below that, what are we talking about? Define for me what it is you want to see gone. Any gun out there right now that's legal that the general public has, you pull the trigger once, you fire one round. Or what do you want to go beyond that? Because that's what's out there, and if you're going to start splitting hairs about what to take away, that's what I have a problem. I don't have a problem, like I said, me personally, I don't have a problem with the magazine ban limitation.
I'm going to get back to you, and Mayor, we have about 5 minutes left, so we encourage your participation. There's a school of thought out there that, well, if more people are armed, for example, if more people had been armed in that club, that shooter could have been stopped. You align yourself with that sort of thing?
Like I say, I personally don't own guns for self-defense. That's not my thing. That's me personally. So I wouldn't want to make that argument on their behalf because that's not why I own guns. That's me personally. So I wouldn't want to say one way or the other on that issue because that doesn't pertain to me.
You wanted to answer?
Well, first of all, I know PJ, and I'm with him when it comes to his use of firearms, his possession of firearms, the types of firearms. You haven't heard me talking about banning anything right now. So I'd look at somebody like him and ask him, what's this gun used for? How is it used? Can you use it for sports? Is it useful for self-defense? I'd want to talk about that. On the other hand, to try to keep, and I think both of us agree, to take every reasonable step you can to keep guns out of the hands of people who use them unlawfully. Are we going to be 100%? We're lucky if we're 5%. But to do it in a way that it doesn't mess with PJ's right to possess and lawfully use firearms for whatever sporting purpose he wants to use them for, if we could find that, and I think we can. The other thing is, with using assault weapon or sporting weapon or all that stuff, you can call a duck a pig, but it's still a duck. Who
I don't
cares?
know any ducks that are called pigs though.
Well, who cares? Who cares? Those are political terms. Those are people who want to use it for, assault weapon. Why should anybody possess an assault weapon? Well, it's not. It's just a sporting. Well, those are the two sides just using their terms to try to argue with each other. Neither of them mean a whole lot. Why don't we just talk about what it does, how useful it is, what lawful purpose it has, and if it has a possibility or a high probability of being useful to someone who would use it unlawfully, how we keep it out of the hands of that person.
I want to say he did mention legal for sporting purposes. I want to say I do support people's rights who do own guns for self-defense.
So do I.
that.
So do I. I just said sporting purposes because you indicated that's what you have them for. So.
I've got about a minute left. I want to squeeze in another question, Andrea.
Okay, this is from Alex on Facebook. How do you both feel about people on the no-fly list being able to purchase a gun? Is legislation needed?
Alex on Facebook asking me about the no-fly list. Should people on the no-fly list be able to purchase firearms? We've got about a minute left, 30 seconds.
If I can't get an airplane with them, I don't want them on a firearm. I'll just put it that way. And I think their due process rights ought to be protected. There ought to be a way to get off of the no-fly list if you're on there inappropriately. But on the other hand, I think it's crazy.
PJ, no-fly list, 30 seconds.
My reflex reaction would be to say, I don't want somebody like that owning a gun either. However, I should qualify that I don't really know much about what it takes to be on the no-fly list, or if there's a process to get off of it. Like if I'm on it once, I'm on it for the rest of my life. If that's the case, then maybe that's not a good thing. But certainly my reflex reaction would be, yeah, I don't want that person to have it. But I don't know enough about the no-fly list to speak one way or the other definitively.
I ride, I don't fly.
PJ Reilly, Mayor Rick Gray, we thank you both for joining us. We certainly haven't solved the debate here today, but we have proven that it can be discussed reasonably and responsibly. We appreciate you joining us. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Jay.
See you, Paige.
You
It's
bet.
good to see you.
Thanks.
You too, man. I think you and I have had that discussion many times before.
Yeah, it's, both sides, the point I was making with the assault weapon and all, both sides have their emotionally tone terms.
Yeah.
The NRA tries to tone it down, the other side, oh, assault